Close your eyes for a moment. Listen to the silence between heartbeats, that quiet space where memory lives. Can you hear it? The whisper of turning pages that will never turn again. The echo of voices speaking truths that dissolved into sand and sea. The soft crackle of papyrus scrolls holding secrets we will never know. This is the story of humanity's greatest dream and its most haunting loss. This is the story of the Great Library of Alexandria. The year is 332 before the Common Era. A young Macedonian king stands on the northern coast of Egypt, looking out across the Mediterranean Sea. His name is Alexander, though history will call him great. He has conquered an empire that stretches from Greece to the edges of India, but here, on this windswept shore where the desert meets the endless blue, he envisions something different. Not a fortress, not a palace, but a city. He traces lines in the sand with his foot, mapping streets that do not yet exist. He points to the horizon where an island called Pharos rises from the water, already imagining the lighthouse that will one day guide ships home through the darkness. The air tastes of salt and possibility. The sun burns overhead like a promise being made. Alexander sees what others cannot. He sees Greek columns rising beside Egyptian temples. He sees scholars from Persia walking alongside philosophers from Athens. He sees knowledge flowing like the Nile itself, nourishing everything it touches. He sees a place where the boundaries between nations dissolve, where ideas matter more than armies, where the human mind can finally be free. He names this dream Alexandria. 1 year later, Alexander is dead at 32, his body carried back to the city he founded but barely lived to see. His empire fractures like broken pottery, divided among his generals who had been brothers in battle but are now rivals in peace. Egypt falls to Ptolemy, a man who had fought beside Alexander since they were boys. Ptolemy understands war. He understands power. But more than either of these, he understands his friend's vision. As Ptolemy establishes himself not just as conqueror, but as pharaoh, he looks at the city Alexander left behind and sees its potential burning like a beacon. Alexandria is growing rapidly, filling with merchants and sailors, refugees and dreamers. Wide boulevards stretch in perfect grids. Buildings of granite and marble rise where once there was only sand. The harbor fills with ships from every corner of the known world. Languages blend in the marketplace like colors on an artist's palette. But Ptolemy wants more. He wants something that will outlast armies and outlive kings. He wants to build something that has never been built before. He wants to gather all human knowledge in one place. The idea is audacious. It is unprecedented. It is beautiful in its ambition and terrifying in its scope. Libraries exist, certainly. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal built one in Nineveh in the 7th century before the Common Era, filling it with clay tablets in multiple languages. Athens had public collections. Private scholars hoarded manuscripts like treasure, but these were fragments, pieces. Ptolemy dreams of totality. He dreams of the first universal library. To realize this vision, Ptolemy summons a man named Demetrius of Phalerum. Once, Demetrius governed Athens, where philosophy was born and democracy first drew breath. But Athens has fallen on difficult times, and Demetrius finds himself in exile, seeking shelter in Alexandria. He is a philosopher, a student of Aristotle's Peripatetic school, a man who believes that knowledge is the highest human pursuit. When Ptolemy shares his vision, Demetrius does not hesitate. In approximately 295 BCE, work begins. The complex they build is unlike anything the world has seen. It is called the Mausion, the Temple of the Muses, those 9 goddesses who inspire all human creativity. But this is no ordinary temple. There are no sacrificial altars dripping with blood, no priests chanting prayers to distant gods. Instead, there are lecture halls where knowledge is the only deity worshipped. There are laboratories where the secrets of matter and motion are pursued. There are observatories where scholars map the heavens with meticulous care. There are gardens where rare plants from distant lands grow in carefully tended beds, each one a living library of botanical knowledge. There is a zoo housing animals that most Alexandrians have only heard of in travelers' tales. Elephants from Africa, lions from the desert, creatures that seem to have stepped out of myth into breathing, tangible reality. There are dining halls where scholars from different nations share meals and ideas, where a mathematician from Syracuse might debate a poet from Athens, where an astronomer from Babylon might exchange theories with a physician from Pergamon. There are living quarters where these brilliant minds can reside, free from financial worry, funded by royal patronage, given one precious gift above all others: time to think. And at the heart of it all, there are the books. The royal library itself, established by Ptolemy's son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, is a wonder that defies description. Some accounts speak of 40,000 papyrus scrolls, others claim 400,000. The truth, like so much about the library, has been lost to time, dissolved in the very obscurity it was meant to prevent. But whether tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, the scale is staggering. In an age where each book must be copied by hand, where a single manuscript represents months of painstaking labor, the Library of Alexandria assembles a collection that dwarfs anything else in existence. The Ptolemies are ruthless in their acquisition. They issue a decree that becomes legendary. Any ship entering Alexandria's harbor must surrender every book on board. Port officials search vessels with the thoroughness of customs agents. Manuscripts are seized, taken to the library, where a decision is made. If the text is new, something the library does not already possess, scribes make a copy on the finest papyrus. The copy is returned to the ship's owner, along with compensation for the inconvenience. The original remains in Alexandria, stamped with the designation from the ships. Sometimes the Ptolemies are even more aggressive. When Ptolemy III desires the original manuscripts of the great Greek playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, he approaches Athens with a proposal. These precious texts are kept in the state archives, never loaned, never risked. But Ptolemy offers an enormous deposit, 15 talents of gold, roughly 1,000 pounds of the precious metal. It is a fortune beyond imagining, security against any possible loss. Athens agrees. The manuscripts are sent to Alexandria for copying. Ptolemy has copies made on the finest papyrus available, perfect reproductions. Then he does something unexpected. He sends the copies back to Athens and tells them to keep the gold. The originals stay in Alexandria. It is theft. It is brilliant. It is a statement of priority that echoes through the centuries. Knowledge is worth more than gold. The library quickly becomes more than a repository of books. It becomes the beating heart of human intellectual achievement. Scholars flock to Alexandria from across the known world, drawn by the promise of access to this unprecedented collection, by the chance to join a community of the greatest minds of the age, by the opportunity to pursue knowledge without the constant pressure of survival. The Ptolemies fund them generously. These scholars receive salaries, tax exemptions, free room and board. They are given a gift that few people in any age receive: the freedom to dedicate their lives entirely to learning. No need to farm, no need to trade, no need to worry about the next meal or the leaking roof or the unpaid debt. Just books and time and the infinite questions that drive human curiosity. And oh, what they accomplish. Zenodotus of Ephesus becomes the first head librarian, and he tackles one of the ancient world's greatest challenges: the poems of Homer. The Iliad and Odyssey exist in countless versions, each slightly different, changed by memory and transcription, fragmented across the Greek-speaking world. Zenodotus begins the monumental task of comparing manuscripts, identifying errors, establishing a standard text. He is attempting nothing less than the preservation of the foundational epics of Greek civilization. His work will echo through the centuries, influencing every edition of Homer that follows. Then comes Callimachus, a poet and scholar whose ambition matches the library's own. Faced with hundreds of thousands of scrolls, he recognizes an essential problem. How do you find anything in such vastness? So Callimachus creates the Pinakies, the tables, the world's first library catalog. It is a monumental work, running to 120 volumes, organizing every text in the collection by author, title, and subject: philosophy, poetry, history, natural science, mathematics, medicine, law, rhetoric, each category carefully delineated, each work cataloged with precision. The Pinakies itself does not survive. Time will consume it as it consumed so much else. But references to it in later works hint at its revolutionary nature. Callimachus does not simply list books. He provides biographical information about authors. He notes variations between different manuscripts. He offers critical judgments. He creates a tool that transforms the library from an overwhelming mass of papyrus into something navigable, something scholars can actually use. Apollonius of Rhodes serves as the second head librarian, and he composes the Argonautica, an epic poem about Jason and the Argonauts that stands as one of the great works of Hellenistic literature. But it is his successor who will achieve something even more remarkable. Eratosthenes of Cyrene arrives in Alexandria and becomes the third head librarian around 246 before the Common Era. He is a man of extraordinary range: mathematician, geographer, astronomer, grammarian, philosopher, historian, poet. His contemporaries call him second only to Plato as a thinker. But Eratosthenes is interested in more than abstract philosophy. He wants to measure the world itself. He has heard that in Siena, far to the south on the summer solstice, the sun at noon casts no shadow. It shines directly down a well, illuminating the water at the bottom. But in Alexandria, at the same moment, objects cast shadows. Eratosthenes understands what this means. The earth is curved. It is a sphere. And if you know the angle of the sun's rays in two different places, and you know the distance between those places, you can calculate the circumference of the entire planet. So Eratosthenes measures. He places sticks in the ground. He records the angle of their shadows. He hires a man to pace the distance from Alexandria to Siena, counting every step. Then he performs his calculation. His answer: the Earth's circumference is approximately 46,250 kilometers. The actual circumference, as we know today, is 40,075 kilometers. Eratosthenes is off by 15%. In an age before precision instruments, before accurate maps, before any real understanding of how to measure vast distances, he comes within 15% of the truth. It is a staggering achievement, one that will not be matched for more than 1,000 years. He does not stop there. Eratosthenes creates a map of the entire known world, incorporating information from the library's vast collection. Accounts of Alexander's campaigns in India, reports from Ptolemaic elephant hunting expeditions along the East African coast, navigational records from merchant ships, geographical texts from dozens of cultures. He pioneers the use of latitude and longitude. He argues that India could be reached by sailing west from Spain, an idea that will eventually inspire a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus 1,500 years later. But perhaps Eratosthenes' most revolutionary contribution is philosophical. He argues that poetry should not be read as literal truth. Homer's epics are meant to capture the soul, to move the heart, not to provide accurate geography. He mocks those who try to locate Odysseus's wanderings on an actual map, saying you could only find those places when you find the leather worker who stitched the bag of the winds. In this, he is championing something essential: the distinction between artistic truth and factual truth, between myth and history, between the emotional landscape and the physical one. The scholars of Alexandria pursue knowledge in every direction. Hero of Alexandria invents the Aeolipile, the first recorded steam engine, centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Euclid writes The Elements, a geometry textbook that will be used for 2,300 years, teaching every subsequent generation from Kepler to Newton to Einstein. Aristophanes of Byzantium invents the system of Greek diacritical marks that clarifies how ancient texts should be read. He is the first to divide poetic texts into lines, creating the format we still use today. Herophilus and Erasistratus study human anatomy, pushing against social taboos that forbid the dissection of corpses. They distinguish between motor and sensory nerves. They trace veins and arteries back to the heart. They name parts of human anatomy, creating a language that doctors will use for millennia. Their original works do not survive, but their ideas persist in fragments, quoted and referenced by later physicians, echoing across the centuries. And there are others, so many others. Aristarchus of Samothrace, who produces definitive editions of Homer with extensive commentaries. Hipparchus, who catalogues the stars and discovers that they move slowly across the heavens over vast periods of time. Galen, whose medical texts will dominate Western medicine until the Renaissance. Archimedes, the greatest mathematical mind of antiquity, who studies in Alexandria before returning to Syracuse to continue his work. They debate, they discover, they write, and all of it flows through the library, this vast engine of human thought, this place where knowledge accumulates like sedimentary layers of stone, each generation building on what came before. Try to imagine it. 400,000 papyrus scrolls, perhaps more, arranged in the library's stacks, each one copied by hand, the scribe's fingers cramping after hours of transcription, eyes straining in lamplight. Each one representing not just text, but time, labor, care. The library holds every work of Homer, in multiple versions from different cities, each one slightly different, preserving variations in dialect and interpretation. It holds the complete works of the great Greek playwrights, 123 plays by Sophocles, though only 7 will survive to reach our age. The works of Aeschylus, the plays of Euripides, the complete works of Sappho, the great lyric poet whose 9 volumes of poetry, 10,000 lines speaking of love and loss and the aching beauty of human experience, are preserved here in their entirety. Today, we have only 650 lines. The rest have vanished like morning mist. The library contains medical texts from Greece, Egypt, and Babylon, mathematical treatises from Euclid, from Archimedes, from mathematicians whose names time has erased, astronomical observations from Babylonian priests who watched the heavens for centuries, recording the movements of planets with meticulous precision, philosophical works from the pre-Socratic thinkers, from Democritus, who proposed that matter consists of atoms, from Anaximander, who theorized about the nature of infinity, from minds that asked questions we are still trying to answer. There are histories, accounts of wars and kings, of cities rising and falling, of migrations and plagues and innovations. There are geographical texts describing lands most Alexandrians will never see, maps of territories that exist only in travelers' tales. There are books on agriculture, on architecture, on engineering. There are legal texts, collections of laws from different cities and different cultures. There are works of rhetoric, teaching the art of persuasive speech. There are poems about gods and heroes, about love and war, about the simple joy of a cup of wine shared with friends on a warm evening. The library contains Egyptian texts, including the Septuagint, the translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek commissioned by Ptolemy II. It holds Persian texts, Indian texts, texts from cultures that have since disappeared, leaving only these written traces of their existence. It holds original manuscripts, the actual papyrus touched by the author's hand, the first draft of works that will be copied and recopied for centuries. And it holds texts we will never know existed, works whose titles are lost, authors whose names have been erased, ideas that might have changed the world, but instead dissolved into silence. The library is not just a warehouse of scrolls. It is an organized system, a living organism designed to make knowledge accessible. The Pinnaces of Callimachus provides the framework, but the physical organization is equally sophisticated. Scrolls are stored in labeled containers, grouped by subject and author. They are tagged with information about their origin, marked with notes about variations between different versions. There are reading rooms where scholars can unroll papyrus carefully, scanning for specific passages. There are scriptoriums where trained scribes copy texts, their hands moving with practiced precision, reproducing manuscripts letter by letter. Every copy must be checked, compared to the original, corrected for any errors that might have crept in. It is slow work, painstaking work, but it is essential. In an age before printing, before any mechanical means of reproduction, human hands and human eyes are the only way to preserve and disseminate knowledge. The museum complex that houses the library resembles a modern university. There are lecture halls where senior scholars teach students, passing on not just facts, but methods, ways of thinking, approaches to problems. There are spaces for informal discussion, where ideas can be tested and challenged. There is equipment for scientific study, astronomical instruments for measuring celestial positions, anatomical tools for studying the human body, mathematical devices for complex calculations. And there is something else, something harder to measure, but equally important. There is a community. These scholars come from different cities, different cultures, different traditions. They speak different languages, worship different gods, carry different assumptions about how the world works. But here in Alexandria, they share something fundamental. They share curiosity. They share the belief that the world can be understood, that human reason can penetrate mysteries, that knowledge is worth pursuing for its own sake. They argue, they disagree, they compete for status and recognition, but they also collaborate, building on each other's work, citing each other's findings, creating a collective endeavor that transcends individual ego. This is what the library enables, not just the preservation of existing knowledge, but the creation of new knowledge, the advancement of human understanding. But nothing gold can stay. Nothing perfect lasts. The library's golden age begins to tarnish. The rot starts from within. Ptolemy VIII, who rules from 145 to 116 before the Common Era, is suspicious of intellectuals. He sees them as potential threats, men whose loyalty to ideas might exceed their loyalty to the throne. In 145, he expels foreign scholars from Alexandria. The brain drain begins. Brilliant minds scatter across the Mediterranean, taking their knowledge to other cities, other courts, other patrons. The position of head librarian, once one of the most prestigious appointments in the known world, begins to lose its luster. Ptolemy VIII appoints a palace guard named Sidus to the role, a clear sign that the position has become political rather than scholarly. Later, Ptolemies give the job to supporters, to loyalists, to men chosen for their connections rather than their learning. As patronage declines, so does maintenance. Scrolls that wear out are not replaced. New acquisitions slow. The copying work that is essential to preservation becomes sporadic. The buildings age without proper upkeep. The careful organization begins to fray. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the library is still functioning, still significant, but it is no longer the unchallenged center of the intellectual world. Then comes war. The year is 48 before the Common Era. Julius Caesar is pursuing his rival Pompey to Egypt. He arrives in Alexandria just as Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra are locked in a civil war for the throne. Caesar allies with Cleopatra, but Ptolemy's forces trap him in the royal palace, hemmed in by the Egyptian fleet in the harbor. Caesar makes a decision that will echo through history. He orders his men to set fire to the Egyptian ships. The plan works. The fleet burns. But fire does not respect boundaries. It does not stop at the water's edge. The flames spread to the docks, to warehouses, to buildings near the shore. Chaos erupts in the city. How much of the library burns? The ancient sources disagree. The philosopher Seneca, quoting the historian Livy, claims 40,000 scrolls are destroyed. Plutarch mentions the Great Library. Dio Cassius speaks of manuscript warehouses near the port. But other evidence suggests the main library, located in the palace quarter away from the harbor, survives largely intact. Perhaps what burns are warehouses of manuscripts waiting for export, duplicates and copies rather than the irreplaceable originals. Still, the damage is real, knowledge is lost, and more importantly, the event marks a turning point. Alexandria is no longer safe. The city becomes a battleground in Rome's civil wars, a prize to be fought over, a place where political violence can erupt at any moment. The library persists, but its glory days are behind it. Under Roman rule, it receives uneven support. Some emperors value learning and fund the institution. When fire destroys libraries in Rome in 80 of the Common Era, the Emperor Domitian sends scribes to Alexandria to copy lost texts, confirming that the collection still exists, and is still valued. The Emperor Hadrian visits the museum in 130 of the Common Era and engages in philosophical discussions with scholars there. But the Roman Empire itself is changing. As Christianity rises, the old pagan learning becomes suspect. The library, with its Greek philosophical texts, its scientific treatises that challenge religious narratives, its celebration of human reason over divine revelation, becomes a target. In 391 of the Common Era, the Christian Emperor Theodosius issues a decree: all pagan temples must be destroyed. Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria, acts with zeal. He orders the demolition of the Serapeum, the temple to Serapis that houses a daughter branch of the library. Christian mobs attack, destroying statues, burning manuscripts, converting the sacred space into a church. What percentage of the collection is lost in this destruction? We do not know. But the message is clear. The old world of pagan learning is ending. The museum itself, the great complex that once hummed with scholarly activity, begins to empty. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, membership has effectively ceased. The buildings fall into disrepair. The organized system breaks down. Manuscripts that once were carefully cataloged and preserved are now scattered, neglected, vulnerable. And then, in 415 of the Common Era, something terrible happens. Her name is Hypatia. She is the daughter of Theon, a mathematician and the last recorded member of the museum. Growing up surrounded by books, by scholars, by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, Hypatia becomes something extraordinary. A female philosopher and mathematician in an age that views women as property. She studies astronomy, mathematics, philosophy. She edits her father's commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, the great astronomical work. She writes her own treatises on mathematics, including a commentary on Diophantus's Arithmetica and a work on the conic sections of Apollonius. She masters the philosophy of Neoplatonism, the belief that all existence emanates from a single transcendent source. And she teaches. Hypatia's public lectures draw crowds from across the Mediterranean world. She wears the robes of a philosopher and walks through the center of Alexandria, speaking about Plato and Aristotle, about mathematics and astronomy, about the nature of reality itself. In a time of increasing religious intolerance, she represents something dangerous, the idea that human reason, rather than divine revelation, can lead to truth. She is also politically influential. Hypatia advises Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, on matters of governance and philosophy. This brings her into conflict with Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria, a man determined to consolidate Christian power and eliminate pagan influence. Cyril sees Hypatia as a threat, not just to his religious authority, but to his political ambitions. He begins a smear campaign, spreading rumors that she practices sorcery, that she is preventing Orestes from reconciling with the church, that she represents everything wrong with the old pagan world. In March of 415, during the holy season of Lent, a mob of Christian zealots led by a lector named Peter surrounds Hypatia on the street. They drag her from her chariot. They take her to a church that was once a temple to the Caesars. There, they murder her, using broken pottery shards to flay the flesh from her bones. They dismember her body and burn the pieces. The empire is shocked. For centuries, philosophers have been seen as effectively untouchable, respected even during civil violence. The murder of a female philosopher at the hands of a Christian mob sends a message. The new order has no place for the old learning. Intellectual inquiry itself has become dangerous. Hypatia has no successor. Her school collapses. The last formal connection to the great scholarly tradition of Alexandria is severed. The remaining pagan scholars begin to leave, seeking positions in cities where they might be safer, where learning is still valued over religious conformity. The library does not end in one dramatic moment. There is no single great fire that consumes everything. Instead, it fades. It decays. It dissolves like salt in water, slowly disappearing until nothing remains but memory. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, civil wars have ravaged Alexandria. The royal quarter, the Bruchion, where the library stood, is partially destroyed. Buildings are damaged. Collections are scattered. Some manuscripts are sold. Others simply rot. Papyrus degrading in the humid Mediterranean climate. Text becoming illegible. Knowledge reverting to blank pages. The conversion from papyrus scrolls to parchment codices in the 4th century accelerates the loss. Old scrolls, seen as obsolete, are not transferred to the new format. The cost of copying is prohibitive. A scribe charges 25 denarii for 100 lines of the best transcription, a gold coin's worth of labor. Who will pay to copy ancient pagan texts when the church needs Bibles? Who will preserve philosophical treatises that contradict Christian doctrine? Some texts survive in Christian libraries, copied by monks who value learning despite its pagan origins. The Library of Caesarea, the theological libraries of Jerusalem and Constantinople, preserve fragments of classical knowledge, but these are selective. Texts deemed compatible with Christianity are copied. Those that challenge church teaching or simply seem unimportant to Christian scholars are allowed to disappear. By the 7th century, when Arab armies conquer Egypt in 642 of the Common Era, there is no evidence that the library still exists. The famous story of Caliph Omar ordering the remaining manuscripts burned to heat bathhouses, dismissing them with the logic that texts either agree with the Quran or contradict it, and therefore are either superfluous or heretical, is almost certainly fiction. It appears in sources written centuries later, long after anyone could verify what actually happened. The truth is simpler and sadder. By the time the Arabs arrive, the library has already been gone for generations. The buildings are ruins. The collection is scattered or destroyed. The scholars have fled or converted or died. What once was humanity's greatest repository of knowledge has become nothing but empty shells and fading memories. We will never know the full extent of what vanished, but we can glimpse it in shadows, in fragments, in the haunting absence of texts that we know existed but can no longer read. Of the 123 plays Sophocles wrote, we have 7. That means 116 plays, works that ancient audiences considered masterpieces, have been erased from existence. We have lost similar proportions of Aeschylus and Euripides. Of Sappho's 10,000 lines of poetry, we retain only 650. 93% of her work is gone. We know its quality from those fragments that survive, from ancient critics who praised her genius. But we cannot read it. We cannot hear her voice. The library held scientific texts that were centuries ahead of their time. We know from references that scholars proposed heliocentric models of the solar system, that they theorized about atoms and the nature of matter, that they made astronomical calculations of stunning accuracy. But the detailed texts, the full explanations, the accumulated observations, these are lost. We have lost mathematical treatises, medical texts, geographical works, historical accounts, philosophical dialogues. We have lost entire genres of literature. We have lost languages and scripts that were documented in the library's collection, but are now illegible, their meanings sealed away forever. We have lost texts from civilizations that have since disappeared, leaving no other record of their existence. The loss is not just of individual works, but of connections. The library allowed scholars to compare texts from different cultures, to see patterns and parallels, to build comprehensive theories. Without it, knowledge fragmenta, isolated insights preserved in scattered libraries across the Mediterranean. But the systematic study, the comparative approach, the comprehensive synthesis, this becomes nearly impossible. Some scholars argue that if the library had survived, the Renaissance might have occurred 1,000 years earlier. The scientific method, the careful observation and testing that emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries, existed in nascent form at Alexandria. Eratosthenes measuring the earth, Herophilus dissecting bodies, Hero experimenting with steam. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader culture of empirical inquiry. When that culture was destroyed, when the library's collections were scattered and burned, when the scholarly community was dispersed by violence and intolerance, humanity lost not just books, but momentum. The collective intellectual project that had been building for centuries came to a halt. The light did not go out all at once, but it dimmed significantly, flickering in isolated monasteries and courts, while the systematic pursuit of knowledge that had flourished in Alexandria faded into memory. Yet not everything was lost. Arab scholars, encountering the remnants of classical learning, recognized its value. They translated Greek texts into Arabic. Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, Eratosthenes. The works that had survived the destruction of the library found new life in Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Damascus. Islamic civilization became the guardian of classical knowledge, preserving texts that Christian Europe had abandoned or destroyed. When European crusaders encountered the Arab world in the 11th and 12th centuries, they discovered these translations. Greek philosophy and science, lost to the West for centuries, suddenly became available again. Latin translations of Arabic translations of Greek originals began circulating in European universities. This rediscovery helped spark the Renaissance, that explosion of learning and creativity that transformed European civilization. But the transmission was incomplete. Many texts never made it from Greek to Arabic. Others were translated, but then lost in later wars and conquests. What reached Renaissance Europe was a fraction of what Alexandria had held, filtered through multiple translations, distorted by time and cultural difference, fragmentary echoes of a once comprehensive collection. Christian monasteries also preserved some classical texts, copied by monks who saw value in pagan learning, even while rejecting pagan religion. The elements of Euclid survived because monks recognized its utility. Homer survived because his epics were considered foundational to education. Medical texts survived because sick people need healing, regardless of religious affiliation. But much did not survive. Texts deemed too pagan, too challenging to Christian doctrine, too irrelevant to monastic life, were simply not copied. And in an age before printing, when every text had to be laboriously transcribed by hand, what was not copied ceased to exist. Papyrus degrades, parchment rots, words fade. The only immortality a text can achieve is to be copied again and again, passed from generation to generation. Texts that were not copied, for whatever reason, died. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria has become a symbol, a warning, a reminder of what humanity can lose when knowledge is devalued, when learning is seen as dangerous, when the preservation of the past is sacrificed to the passions of the present. Every time a library burns, whether in Baghdad in 2003 or in Sarajevo in 1992, people invoke Alexandria. Every time books are banned or burned, when totalitarian regimes try to control what their citizens can read, when religious fundamentalists destroy art and texts that offend their beliefs, the ghost of the library whispers a caution. This has happened before, and the loss echoes through centuries. But the library's legacy is not only a warning, it is also an inspiration. The Ptolemies' dream of a universal library, a place where all human knowledge could be gathered and preserved, has never died. It resurfaces again and again throughout history. In the 18th century, museums began to model themselves on the Museum of Alexandria, creating institutions dedicated to the systematic study and preservation of human knowledge. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Smithsonian, all echo Alexandria's ambition, though they focus on objects rather than texts. In the 19th and 20th centuries, national libraries proliferated. The Library of Congress, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the British Library. Each attempts in its own way to be comprehensive, to collect and preserve the written record of human civilization. They cannot be truly universal, as the Ptolemies dreamed, but they try. And in the 21st century, the digital age has enabled a new version of the universal library dream. The Internet Archive attempts to preserve websites and digital content. Google Books digitizes millions of books. Wikipedia aspires to create a free encyclopedia accessible to everyone with an internet connection. Project Gutenberg makes out-of-copyright texts freely available. These efforts are explicitly inspired by Alexandria, by the vision of knowledge without barriers, learning without borders. In 2002, on the approximate site of the ancient library, a new building opens its doors. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina rises like a vision from Alexandria's past, reimagined for the modern world. Its design is stunning, a circular structure tilted toward the sea with an 11-story capacity to hold up to 8 million volumes. The reading room spans 20,000 square meters, cascading over 7 terraces, accommodating 2,000 readers, one of the largest such spaces in the world. The exterior wall, covered in hand-carved granite panels, displays over 4,000 characters from most of the world's known writing systems: Greek and Latin, Arabic and Chinese, hieroglyphics and cuneiform, musical notation and mathematical symbols, braille and barcodes. It is a physical representation of the library's mission: to honor all forms of human knowledge, to celebrate the diversity of human expression, to pick up the thread that was broken 16 centuries ago. Inside, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina houses more than just books. There is a planetarium. There are museums dedicated to antiquities, manuscripts, science. There is a school for information science. There are conservation laboratories working to preserve fragile texts. There are conference rooms where scholars from around the world gather to share their research. There is an Internet Archive backup, a recognition that in the digital age, preservation requires redundancy, multiple copies in multiple locations. The new library hosts over 1,500 programs annually: lectures, conferences, concerts, classes. It welcomes more than 1 million visitors each year. Its themes echo across the centuries: peace, democracy, citizenship, innovative scientific and cultural exchange. It is not trying to recreate the ancient library, an impossible task. Instead, it is building on that legacy, reimagining what a great library can be in the 21st century. Standing in the reading room, looking up at the terraced levels rising above, at the scholars bent over their books, at the sunlight filtering through the tilted roof, you can feel it. The whisper of continuity, the sense that something broken has been, if not restored, then honored and renewed. The dream of the Ptolemies lives again, transformed but recognizable, adapted to a new age but still driven by the same fundamental conviction: that knowledge matters, that learning is worth preserving, that humanity is elevated by access to the accumulated wisdom of the ages. But questions remain. They haunt us like the ghosts of burned scrolls. What if the library had never been destroyed? What if that unbroken chain of learning had continued from Alexandria through the Middle Ages into the modern world? What if the scientific method developed by Hellenistic scholars had been preserved and built upon instead of being lost and rediscovered a millennium later? Would we have reached the Renaissance centuries earlier? Would the Dark Ages have been avoided entirely? Would human civilization have advanced more quickly, achieving in the year 1000 what we only accomplished in the year 2000? Or would it have made no difference? Was the fall of the library simply one symptom of a broader civilizational decline, the inevitable decay of an empire that had grown too large, too diverse, too fractious to hold together? Would other forces, other conflicts, other disasters have achieved the same result through different means? We cannot know. History does not offer us alternative timelines to explore. We have only the world we inherited, shaped by what was lost as much as by what was preserved. The absence of those 400,000 scrolls is as much a part of our civilization as the presence of the texts that survived. But we can remember. We can honor the dream that motivated the Ptolemies, the belief that all human knowledge is worth gathering, that learning transcends national boundaries, that the pursuit of truth is humanity's highest calling. We can recognize in our own age the same forces that threatened Alexandria: the suspicion of learning, the fear of ideas that challenge orthodoxy, the political expedience that value short-term power over long-term preservation. And we can choose differently. We can build libraries, both physical and digital. We can fund scholars. We can make knowledge freely accessible. We can teach our children that books matter, that learning matters, that the accumulated wisdom of previous generations is not a burden, but a gift, hard-won and precious. Close your eyes again. Listen to that silence between heartbeats. But now, listen deeper, because the silence is not quite silent. There is something there, a whisper so faint you must strain to hear it. It is the echo of Eratosthenes measuring the earth, his calculation preserved in references and retellings, even though his original text is lost. It is the ghost of Euclid's Elements, copied and recopied through the centuries, surviving because enough people recognized its value and refused to let it disappear. It is the fragment of Sappho's poetry, those 650 lines rescued from oblivion, still moving us with their beauty 2,500 years after they were written. It is the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, its reading rooms full of students from Egypt and beyond, carrying forward the tradition of learning that the Ptolemies began. It is every library in every city, in every country, each one in its own way, fulfilling the dream of preserving and sharing knowledge. It is the Internet Archive backing up websites, Project Gutenberg digitizing books, Wikipedia growing entry by entry. Each contribution an act of preservation, each edit an acknowledgement that knowledge is fragile and must be actively protected. The Great Library of Alexandria is gone. Its scrolls are dust. Its buildings are ruins. Its scholars are 20 centuries dead. But the idea it represented, the vision it embodied, the dream it incarnated, these are not dead. They cannot die as long as we remember, as long as we choose, again and again, to value knowledge over ignorance, learning over forgetfulness, preservation over destruction. The library whispers to us across the centuries. It speaks in the silence where texts should be, but are not. It calls to us in every book saved from a fire, every manuscript digitized before it crumbles, every story passed from one generation to the next. It reminds us that civilization is fragile, that knowledge can be lost, that what took centuries to build can be destroyed in moments. But it also reminds us that the effort is worth making, that the dream of the universal library, impossible though it may be, is nonetheless noble, that the attempt to gather and preserve human knowledge, to make it accessible to all who seek it, to build bridges between cultures and generations through the medium of the written word, this is among humanity's highest callings. The papyrus scrolls are gone, but their echo remains. The ancient voices are silent, but their wisdom whispers still. The library has fallen, but its spirit endures in every library that opens its doors, in every scholar who dedicates their life to learning, in every reader who opens a book and finds within it a connection to minds long dead but not forgotten. This is the true legacy of the Great Library of Alexandria, not the knowledge that was lost, though that loss is profound, not even the knowledge that was preserved, though we are fortunate to have it, but rather the idea that knowledge is worth pursuing, worth preserving, worth sharing, the conviction that human understanding matters, the belief that we are elevated by learning, diminished by ignorance, and connected across vast distances of time and space by the simple act of reading what others have written. The library is gone, but the dream it represents burns as brightly as ever, a flame passed from hand to hand across the generations, flickering sometimes in the winds of war and intolerance and neglect, but never quite extinguished. As long as we keep that flame alive, as long as we build libraries and write books and read what others have written, the Library of Alexandria has not truly been destroyed. It lives in every library that exists today. It lives in every student who learns. It lives in every teacher who shares knowledge. It lives in every writer who adds to the great conversation that spans the millennia. And it will continue to live as long as we remember, as long as we honor the dream, as long as we keep the whisper alive. Listen, can you hear it? The turning of pages that will never turn, the echo of voices that will never speak again, the whisper of time itself calling across the centuries with a message both simple and profound. Remember, learn, preserve, share. This is what it means to be human. This is what the library taught us. This is what we must not forget. The Great Library of Alexandria is lost, but its whisper endures. And as long as that whisper continues, as long as we listen and respond and carry the dream forward, then, in the truest sense, the library is not lost at all. It lives in us, in every book we read, every library we build, every piece of knowledge we preserve and pass on. The library is dead. Long live the library.